Welcome, everyone, to the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics Spring 2026 Speaker Series. I'm Todd Haw, Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School and the Faculty Director of the ICGE. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by my colleague, Lori Bhaskar, who will introduce our speaker, Ashley Sauciuc, and her talk, Spillover Effects of Corporate Misconduct, in just a moment. But before I turn things over to Lori, I'd like to say just a quick word about the ICGE. So the Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics takes a broad, interdisciplinary, and systems-based approach to corporate governance and ethics research. So not only do we consider corporate governance in its full scope, which includes the areas of finance, management, corporate law, corporate compliance, business and behavioral ethics, and financial controls, but we also aim to make that research accessible to business practitioners. So as part of that effort, last year, the ICGE brought Ethical Systems, a consortium of business and behavioral ethics scholars, to the Kelley School, which doubled the number of our faculty affiliates and created an entirely new network of collaborators under the ICGE umbrella, as well as a new platform to reach business leaders. Bringing the ICGE and Ethical Systems together has created a one-of-a-kind institution that is able to harness the best academic research to aid students, scholars, policymakers, and business leaders in elevating corporate governance and ethical business practices within their organizations. This speaker series is just one of the ways that we're doing that. So please make sure to check out our websites and LinkedIn for new initiatives and activities coming from the ICGE and Ethical Systems in the future. And I should also mention that we recently issued our first report. So you can see everything that we've been doing over the last year. Just go to the ICGE website and please take a look. And so now let me introduce our moderator for today's talk, my colleague and ICGE Research Director, Lori Bhaskar. Lori is an Associate Professor of Accounting and Arthur M. Weimer Faculty Fellow here at the Kelley School. She earned her PhD in accounting from the Georgia Institute of Technology after a BS and MPA in accounting from the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater. Prior to joining academia, Lori worked in public accounting as an auditor at Deloitte. As a scholar, Lori specializes in behavioral auditing research and focuses on topics such as audit quality, assurance, audit regulation, internal control audits, and professional skepticism. Her research has been published in a number of prestigious journals, including the Journal of Accounting Research, the Accounting Review, and Contemporary Accounting Research, among many others. And Lori is also an editor at Auditing, a journal of practice and theory, and at Accounting Horizons. So Lori, please take it away.
Thank you, Todd. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker for today. And I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Ashley Sauciuc, who's here at the Kelley School of Business. Ashley is an assistant professor in our accounting department. She earned her PhD in accounting from the University of Arizona after receiving her bachelor's in accounting from Arizona State University and master's in accounting from the University of Notre Dame. Prior to her PhD, Ashley worked for several years as an auditor and CPA at Deloitte in the Phoenix office. And now her research focuses on incentive systems and ethical decision-making in accounting. She uses experimental methods to apply insights from behavioral economics and psychology to accounting issues relevant to the profession. And her work has been published in top accounting journals such as the Journal of Accounting Research, Accounting Organizations and Society, and Management Science. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashley. As Ashley is presenting, feel free to submit any of your questions into the Q&A function, and she'll be taking a few pauses throughout the presentation. I'll help monitor your questions, and then Todd and I will have some questions as well. So with that, Ashley, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori and Todd, and everyone for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about the spillover effects of corporate misconduct. And I am Ashley Sauciuc, so let's go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen now so we can see the slides. And we can get things started. Okay, so today, we're going to be talking first about what is corporate misconduct, right? Why is it dangerous? How does it spread? What could we do to stop it? And some key takeaways is what we'll wrap up with at the end. But to start things off, I think it's first a good idea to just kind of identify what is corporate misconduct. To do that, we first need to understand the basics of agency theory. Agency theory defines a firm through its principal, it's the owners, right? And its agents, or the managers. And at its core, ultimately, the principal gives decision rights to the agents so that they can run the company, but there's going to be information asymmetry, right? Information asymmetry between the principals and the agents, where the owners can't really see exactly what the managers are doing, means that there's opportunity for misconduct by the agents, right? We've got moral hazard and adverse selection problems. And this can take a variety of forms, right? So when we're thinking about different types of corporate misconduct, there's a large list, right? But some of the most commonly explored types of corporate misconduct, particularly in accounting, tend to focus on things like real earnings management, where managers are actually manipulating real activities within the firm, things like giving extreme price discounts or ramping up production at year end in order to lower cost of goods sold. But all of that is in an effort to meet earnings targets, as opposed to being done in the best interest of the firm. We then have things like fraudulent financial reporting. This is where managers are intentionally misstating or hiding the truth about actual firm performance through the reporting function. And then there's asset misappropriation. This is where we think things like theft or misuse of company assets. That could be assets that are physical assets for the company, or it could even be company time. Think about things like shirking. What we are going to be focusing on primarily in today's discussion is things related to fraudulent financial reporting. And to do that, I think it's first helpful to think about the general conceptual definition of fraud. And we'll kind of use the ACFE, or the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They've got a good conceptual definition of fraud that I think can help guide our discussion. So according to the ACFE, fraud is any intentional act or omission designed to deceive others, results in the victim suffering a loss and or the perpetrator achieving a gain. And this has been studied in a variety of different contexts. So you can think about behavioral economics, accounting, finance, where we generally have found that commonly people are averse to lying, but incentives can drive opportunistic behavior. Some of those incentives could be tied to things like contracting, boosting share price, attracting new financing, relieving distress in distressed firms, and that generally we see strong internal controls as well as corporate governance matters and helps, right? It helps reduce misreporting, but unfortunately it doesn't eliminate it. So why is it dangerous? This is where I'm going to kind of talk about some of the consequences that we know about observed fraud. According to the most recent report from the ACFE, they estimate that about 1% of US public company revenue is lost each year due to known fraud. That might seem like just a tiny little sliver, but it's of a very, very big pie. So in 2025, total revenue in S&P 500 firms was roughly $18 trillion. This means that an estimated 1% loss would equate to nearly 190 billion in annual value that's being lost to known fraud. And that's just among the S&P 500. The hidden cost, including fraud that isn't known, is likely much larger. There are estimates that come in consistently closer to about 5%, which could be, again, benchmarked against the S&P 500 revenue as high as nearly 900 billion. So this is obviously a very big issue when we're talking about the dollar impact of potential fraud. And that potential for the additional unknown fraud is really important because fraud isn't an isolated event. Research shows that observing corporate misconduct sparks this contagion effect among peers. That could be peers within the same company, could be peers within the same industry, doing similar things. But in a recent study that I published last year, work with my co-authors Eric Holtzman, Brian Miller, Christy Rennekamp, we found that this can actually even spread to non-peers that are engaged in entirely unrelated tasks. This is really important because think about the potential span of that spillover effect. Employees engage in reporting tasks every single day. Things like filling out timesheets, budget requests, filing for reimbursements, tax returns. If they see evidence of fraud occurring around them, especially among those in positions of power or prestige, like a corporate executive, right? The question is, does that impact their likelihood and willingness to misreport on their own job? And we test this exact thing in our study. We use an experiment where some participants read innocuous business news, while others read articles about an executive that has committed fraud. And we look at their subsequent reporting behavior on a separate, unrelated task. To give a little bit more detail here, these articles either detail a neutral earnings announcement. They're hypothetical, right? But it's a neutral, again, innocuous business news about an earnings announcement in some conditions or in our control condition. In other conditions, we expose people to hypothetical news articles related to an executive that has committed a large-scale corporate fraud. I'll discuss later how we kind of tweak some of the details in these articles that are related to fraud to do some other tests. But in the baseline fraud condition, we just provide information about executive fraud without any other discussion. After we figure out whether participants really read the articles, confirm that they understood the content, we then move on to the second part of the experiment. This is totally unrelated to the news articles, and the participants are aware of that. In this part of the experiment, participants are asked to perform a real effort task. They have to decode these letter puzzles and solve them as quickly as they can. Their earnings are determined based on their reported performance on the task, where faster times generate higher earnings. And since their pay is entirely based on what they report, in theory, they could report that it took them 1 second to complete all of their work and maximize their earnings. Or they could be entirely truthful and report exactly what they did. We use this task in 2 different experiments, one where we can only infer their misreporting by looking at abnormally high reported earnings, and another where we can directly measure misreporting as the difference between their reported and their actual earnings. What we find is, unfortunately, people do misreport more after reading the articles about the executive fraud. We see a significant spillover effect among these non-peers, where we document a 13 percentage point increase in misreporting in one of our experiments. This was the one where we're observing abnormally high earnings. When people are exposed to news about the executive committing fraud compared to our control condition. And importantly, this non-peer effect has nothing to do with updated beliefs about risk of detection. They're not a peer subject to the same monitoring. They're engaged in an entirely unrelated task, but we still observe that spillover effect. So the question is why? How does that occur? I think before we dig into how it spreads, I think this might be a good place to take a break for some questions that I believe we've got in the Q&A.
Yeah. Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks. Thank you, Ashley. Before we get into the theory and how it spreads, just thinking about the spillover effects in this context, I was just going to take a step back, and we're talking about, corporate misconduct, and you're specifically talking about accounting related and financial corporate misconduct. Obviously, there's a lot of other types of misconduct as well at firms. So I'm thinking about like legal and regulatory violations, environmental misconduct in terms of reporting, like maybe greenwashing, or ethical misconduct. So we have a lot of examples of related, like tone at the top, ethical misconduct happening that's not accounting and financial. So what comes to mind for me is something like an astronomer in July 2024, the Coldplay Kiss Cam favorite. Like obviously ethical misconduct was, I know you're going to talk about in the future about public shaming. So I'm just getting your thoughts in advance about, do you see your theory, the spillover effect, and like later the deterrent effects you'll talk about, generalizing to just misconduct in these other areas as well?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. And this is something that we'll get into as we think about the psychological effects of how this spreads. But really the foundation of the theory is not particular to specific types of fraudulent financial reporting, right? And so I do think that this could apply to all sorts of types of misconduct, because we're ultimately talking about as I'll discuss, descriptive and injunctive norms that govern what society says is acceptable, and how our psychological rationalization mechanisms can come into play to help us rationalize unethical behavior, and then how that might spread in an organization. Does that have to specifically be related to fraudulent financial reporting or reporting mechanics per se? I don't think so. Now, what we test is a reporting setting. So of course, it's an open empirical question, but the theory isn't particular to fraudulent financial reporting as opposed to other forms of misconduct. So do I think it probably would apply to other forms of violations or ethical misconduct or greenwashing? Potentially. I think that the theory would support that it would apply in those other types of contexts. We even find in the literature related to rationalizations and moral disengagement and moral licensing that a lot of that foundational theory is in psychology and sociology, where it's looking at other contexts beyond even business. So I think that it's a very general and robust theory to where it would apply in a lot of settings.
Just a quick point here, Ashley. So first of all, I love this vein of inquiry because it really brings together, obviously, sort of like a whole behavioral ethics aspect, which not everybody, we have this great consortium network and ethical systems. They're all interested in these topics, but they're not always reading accounting literature necessarily. And so I think it's a great demonstration about how some of these themes kind of cut across these typical silos that we see. I did want to ask you a quick question, though, about timing. So you give sort of that you prime the subjects with the statements of what somebody else is doing. Do you have any sense about how long this effect might last? Does it matter that they're getting the task right after? What if they would have gotten a week or 2 weeks or 2 months later? Do you think you'd see the same effect?
Sure. So I think that's a great question. We haven't looked at how long and persistent the effect is over time. What I will say is, yeah, in the experiment, you're looking at a span of like 5 or 10 minutes between when they're reading articles about something and then they're conducting another task. Although granted, the performance of the task also increases that time to where it might be closer to 15 minutes or so.
Right.
But still, we're talking minutes here, not weeks and months. I will say, just based on my own experience with exposure to the news, it's not that this is happening once. We're kind of being inundated frequently with this information. And so is it to say that I'll see one article once and then 3 months later it might affect a decision? Or could I be watching the news in the morning before going to work and having that prime my beliefs about the descriptive norms in society that people are engaging in this misconduct and have that influence my behavior? I think it does generalize in that way. But I think that it's a great question in terms of how frequently does someone need to be exposed to this, and how long does the effect last ultimately over time?
Yeah, that's great. It's really interesting because I did think when reading your paper that this probably applies to so many things, and it's very interesting, a little bit frightening. And then before we move on, and you were just talking about, we're being inundated with these things kind of daily, it feels like. I was kind of curious, the statistics that you brought up from the report on fraud. I mean, it's staggering. It's a really large dollar value. And I was curious, just in general, about maybe you can talk about any trends that we've observed over time, because I feel like we've been in kind of a 20-year period of increased regulation and, higher scrutiny on corporate fraud, at least from an accounting perspective with like the PCAOB and the SEC. And we may have hit a peak in 2024, at least from like a resource and budget perspective. It seems that we're maybe on a decrease. And so this has implications in terms of if there are deterrent effects from this increased regulation. Have we seen that in the past, like with the increased regulation? Has there been a decreasing trend in the fraud reported in these studies over time? And that kind of helps us think about what might happen in the future. Do you have any perspective on that?
Sure. So what I can say is the ACFE does these reports over time. And in the last few years, it's been pretty consistent in terms of what the expectation is of like the global unknown potential effect of fraud, hovering around 5% each year in terms of revenue loss. But that's also of a period of time post Sarbanes-Oxley, right? And so if we look back to before that regulation really started ramping up, it was higher, right? We were seeing things, I think that they were reporting closer to about 7%. And in general, they're finding, even when they're comparing US public company estimated revenue loss compared to private companies, there's a significant difference. And it could be even things like going from 2.5% to 5% when you go to outside of US public companies. And so the implication there is that the regulation of being a public company could actually be helping curb and control some of this, where again, that increased corporate governance, whether it's from an audit committee or tighter internal controls or greater regulation at the SEC and DOJ, that is all contributing to this environment of reduced misreporting in the public companies compared to in the private sector, where the estimates are higher. And I think that if we look back at pre-SOX, where things were significantly higher, then the implication is that the regulation and the scrutiny is doing a good job. And what that means for going forward in terms of if we're going to see a shift in that, it's a potential concern.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I think maybe now is a good time to jump back into the slides and dig into kind of like how the spillover effect here would actually spread with the psychological effects. So let's talk about this and the rationalization process. I was kind of mentioning a bit about how the psychological theory is very broad and applies in a lot of contexts. And what I was meaning primarily from that is this rationalization process. We're all humans, and so we're all subject to this potential folly of rationalizing unethical behavior. And when people see executives or others that are committing fraud, ultimately what's happening is that observation shifts their baseline. They update their beliefs about the descriptive norms. That's what's happening, how frequently they think something is occurring in society, how common fraud is. And when people like executives are the ones that are committing that fraud at a large scale, it provides people with a really easy way to rationalize their own misconduct in their own life. And that's called advantageous comparison. It's one of a few very common forms of rationalization where you contrast your own misbehavior against something that seems way more egregious. It enables you to kind of downplay your own unethical behavior in comparison and say, this isn't really a big deal. When people do this, it can lead to what we call moral disengagement. That's when you disengage from the moral aspect of an act. You are deactivating your self-sanctioning function, freeing yourself up to act unethically, and that can be really dangerous. If we think about that psychological process, though, in the realm of an organization, think about that tone at the top being kind of the spark. You observe something from someone in a place of power, that might be a spark, but the internal compensation structure and the design of the compensation system within a firm can sometimes act as like the gasoline, a potential systematic accelerant, where what I mean is that the way we structure the incentives of the employees matters. The frequency that we're incentivizing them with performance-based bonuses or rewards could have significant consequences on the norms that develop within an organization. This is really important because people are working together within an organization and people have other regarding preferences. They pay attention to the people around them. So managers need to be aware not just of the frequency of their employees' own incentives, but how frequently those around them are also being subjected to performance-based incentives. Because we need to think about reciprocity in an organization. Reciprocity ultimately reflects behavior that's conditioned on the perceived intentions of another's actions, and people get utility, kind of this, they have an internal value that they are placing on responding in kind, whether that's positively or negatively. If someone does something that I perceive as a kind action towards me, I want to respond with a kind action towards them. If someone responds negatively towards me, I will want to also respond negatively towards them. That's kind of the basics of reciprocity. So expectations of future reciprocity could potentially increase the likelihood of collusion in an organization even if an employee is not currently eligible for an incentive themselves. This is why we need to be aware not just of an employee's own performance-based incentives, but also that of the people around them, because that brings in a risk of collusion. So in my dissertation, I actually examined the effects of incentive frequency on collusion. And I find that the cadence of performance-based incentives actually can help, well, maybe not help, but it actually dictates the psychological pathways that employees are using to rationalize fraud. So think about one setting where you've got relatively infrequent or low frequency of these performance-based incentives. Someone might think to themselves, well, gee, I've been honest for the last 11 months, lying now in order to meet my target for year end. It's fine. It's not a big deal. I'm still a good person. They're ultimately using what's called moral licensing. And it's going to result in an oscillation of behavior, where sometimes you're very good and honest, and then you feel licensed to misbehave, and then you will recover again by being honest. So ultimately, it's defined by when individuals feel licensed to misbehave, what they feel is that they've built up a reserve of good behavior. Unethical behavior can then cause them to have to compensate for that wrongdoing, but they feel licensed to misbehave because they've been good for so long. When you then incentivize someone so frequently or increase the frequency of performance-based incentives, you're removing their ability to rebuild their moral license, right? They don't have enough time to build up 11 months worth of good behavior. So they have to rely on other types of rationalizations. And that's where reciprocity can become rather devious. Think about, well, my coworker lied for me last time. I'll just return the favor and respond reciprocally, right? That's just normal here. It becomes now the norm within the organization that when someone does something for you, you will do that for them. And that can result in an increase in collusion. Not just collusion during those periods of significant incentive, but also there's the potential for a spillover effect, because reciprocity is a self-reinforcing norm where the more times that you reciprocate, the stronger that norm becomes. And so it has the potential to then make reciprocity as a rationalization very easy. And it may be very easy for people to then fully morally disengage from that decision and say, this is just what's done here. And when people morally disengage and rationalize their behavior in that way, they're disengaging that self-sanctioning function, and they're not going to see bad behavior carry as much weight going forward. What does this mean in terms of how they would actually act? Or what do I find? Because in my dissertation, I actually conduct an experiment where participants are paired in groups, and I vary the frequency of significant raise periods. The frequent incentives prevent people from being able to rebuild their moral credits. And what I find is that with more frequency, we see a more permanent spillover effect of collusion into the non-incentivized periods. Everybody always has the opportunity to collude to earn more money each period. But when there are certain periods where the incentives are really large, they're kind of these focal periods. I use raises in my study to really kind of have a strong performance-based incentive. When those significant incentive periods occur relatively infrequently, I see behavior consistent with moral licensing. This is that dark line, right? Under low frequency, where you're only seeing misreporting spike during those periods of significant incentive. And during the other periods, people are behaving with basically full honesty. When those incentive periods happen much more frequently, though, when it seems every other period someone in their team is up for a raise, I see behavior consistent with ethical erosion. You still might see some spikes there during the periods of whether the person themselves or someone on their team is up for a raise. You're also seeing that spill over into the non-raise periods, the periods where they're not strongly incentivized. There's a minimal benefit that they're going to get from this, and they're still colluding. That's dangerous, right? So this implies that highly frequent incentives could actually inadvertently be almost like weaponizing peer reciprocity as a tool to overcome lying aversion, because it's normalizing collusion. It's eroding employees' ethical resolve to the point where they're willing to collude all the time, even when they're not significantly incentivized to do so. So what can we do to stop this? Right, I've kind of talked now all about the dangers, all about the problems, but are we just passive and have to accept that this is always going to happen? No, right? There are things that we can try to do to stop this. Ultimately, what we found is that it's a huge benefit to shift the focus away from descriptive norms. What are people doing? Towards injunctive norms, the fancy term for what's acceptable in society. When we think about what's acceptable in society, punishment for wrongdoing can be a potentially effective deterrent mechanism, right? We can even think about how this relates to kind of the commonly discussed broken windows theory, where observable signs of crime or disorder, right, those broken windows, signal that misconduct is tolerated, right? And that encourages further crime in the area. Repairing those windows, on the other hand, signals the opposite. Misconduct is not tolerated here. And so we make a similar argument in that first paper I mentioned with my co-authors, where we're predicting that enforcing punishment for observable misreporting should actually mitigate the spillover effect of misreporting among non-peers, because it's making salient the injunctive norms that this is not acceptable in society. People are being punished, people are being held accountable for that type of misconduct. It is unacceptable. How do we actually test this, right? Like, what mechanisms are we looking at? We primarily look at three mechanisms. So we look at monetary fines as a form of punishment, imprisonment, and public shaming. With respect to white-collar crime, Title IX of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, that's the SOX Act that I was talking about earlier, that provides regulatory guidance on penalties. And it focuses primarily on monetary fines and imprisonment, both of which are prevalent and used in punishment today. In a 2008 study by, I think this was Karpoff, Lee, and Martin, they document that nearly half of the top executives that were charged with financial misrepresentation in their sample did pay a monetary fine, and that averaged about 14.4 million at the time. They also found that a sizable minority, about 14% of their sample, actually served prison time. And that prison sentence averaged about 6 years. But those aren't the only types of punishment that are available. The US federal sentencing guidelines actually also provide judges with alternative methods of punishment that they could require during sentencing, such as public statements about the wrongdoing in various ways, whether it's on TV or in print. And so we kind of refer to this generally as public shaming. It doesn't carry a fine or a prison sentence, but it's an alternative method that's available to the courts during sentencing that is garnering increased interest. And so in our study, we look at both the commonly used forms of punishment as well as this alternative method to see whether these methods are effective at actually halting a spillover effect. When we think about these punishments, though, from a conceptual standpoint, it's helpful to kind of break them down because they exist on several spectrums, which is nice for theory testing. So obviously, taxpayer cost is a highly relevant consideration when you're thinking about punishment and legal sentencing. So it's relatively low cost to have a monetary fine or even a public shaming as part of a sentencing. It's extremely high taxpayer cost to imprison someone, right? And so oftentimes those are pitted against each other kind of in discussion in terms of, do we want to pay the high taxpayer cost of imprisonment? It's a really severe punishment, so it may be effective, and maybe that's our only avenue to curb this. So we thought about perceived severity, and we thought about the salience of injunctive norms for each of these punishments, and thought these could vary based on the type of punishment. So we actually asked participants in our study about these dimensions for each of the punishments. And we found that, to no one's surprise, imprisonment carries the greatest perceived severity, obviously. Public shaming seemed to be perceived as the least severe punishment. But what was really interesting is that the salience of the injunctive norms we find is highest in both the imprisonment and public shaming punishments. So if our theory is really expecting that shifting people's focus away from descriptive norms and towards injunctive norms will help reduce the spillover effect, then can we look at these different types of punishments and see whether they actually work through that mechanism? Short story is, yes, it does seem to work. Right, so if we remember these results that I showed earlier related to the spillover effect of being exposed to news about executive fraud, but without any disclosed punishments, right? They were only being told about the fraud. That's when we saw that increase in misreporting. When we included then information in hypothetical news articles about punishments that were being levied on the executives for that fraud, whether it was the fine or imprisonment or shaming, we did that separately across conditions. What we observed is a reduction in that spillover effect. This was particularly effective in the imprisonment condition in this experiment. In the other experiment where we can more precisely track actual misreporting, it was also really effective in the shaming condition. But in this case, the prison condition, that one's also the one with the highest severity. So we have to dig further. We don't want to stop here. We want to confirm through mediation analysis whether that injunctive norm was working like we thought it was. So if we think about setting up a mediation analysis, we find that observed punishment does decrease misreporting, and that this effect is at least partially mediated, kind of going through this path of the injunctive norm. By activating people's injunctive norms, we're able to then see that decrease in misreporting, even when we control for perceived severity of the punishment. We found that this holds for both imprisonment and public shaming. So this channel was effective for 2 of our 3 punishments. It was not effective in the monetary fines condition. The monetary fines just weren't able to activate that injunctive norm the same way that imprisonment and public shaming were. So what this tells us ultimately is that it seems activating injunctive norms by holding people accountable can help curb misreporting among others. These are, again, non-peers, not subject to the same detection risk. It's the really difficult people to capture. How are we going to prevent them from being affected by this? Well, activating their injunctive norms can help stop the spread of corporate misconduct among these non-peers. And so I think before we get into kind of key takeaways and some of the internal and external controls we can think about, I think now might be another good time for a break for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I have a few in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and take my opportunity first. I think that this underlying theory is really helpful. It's really important to show like what is driving this spillover and deterrent effect. I'm particularly interested in the public shaming. To me was like the most fascinating from a theoretical perspective. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this potential idea of like a potential backfiring effect almost, because on the one hand, public shaming is increasing the injunctive norm, you should not do this. But on the other hand, it is also providing more public information to more people that this is happening, which could increase the descriptive norm. And so when you were comparing on your results slide, the drop from no punishment to public shaming, you have a drop, but from control, not aware of it, to public shaming, it looks like there maybe is an increase. And it got me thinking, like, which is more powerful, these descriptive norms or these injunctive norms? Because it seems like both are increasing at the same time. And I was just curious to kind of get your thoughts on that in general.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we asked participants questions about the descriptive norms as well to see whether those were increasing. We didn't find that the descriptive norms were actually increasing. We found all of the play was occurring through the injunctive norms. But I think that necessarily when you are talking about punishment for a fraud, you are also saying that fraud happened. And so it's a point very well taken that could we also, even if we didn't observe through our measures the change in the belief about descriptive norms, are we also potentially showing participants or showing people, let's think about this like generalizing beyond just the study, are we showing people that this occurs and that this occurs frequently. I think that we're not going to get away, I don't think, with saying, or nor should we, that no one should ever talk about fraud that's occurring. I think that's naturally going to happen. And that's why even in our experiment, across all of the conditions that are related to fraud, there's always fraud being discussed in the news. That is always occurring because they're reading this through these hypothetical news articles. But it's really about how the punishments themselves could be effective at focusing people not so much on the descriptive norm, but much more on the injunctive norm that, yeah, this happened, but guess what? It's really not acceptable in society. This person was punished and received either a severe or maybe not severe punishment for their crime, but that this is really enforcing that we don't accept this in society and it's unacceptable behavior. And that was the mechanism that we found most consistently influencing people's or helping reduce the misreporting, the spillover effect. And what I will say also in terms of the graph that I showed, that was from one of the studies. So we do actually conduct 2 experiments in that paper. One where we're inferring their misreporting through abnormally high reported earnings. And then another where we actually track exactly what their true results were so that we can see what should have been their exact reported truthful earnings and what did they choose to report so that we can precisely calculate misreporting. And in that case, when we can precisely measure it, we do see that public shaming didn't have any significant difference from the control condition. And it did kind of bring it back down to that baseline.
This made me think of, Cialdini's work talks a lot about descriptive injunctive norms, the idea that you have sort of this like implicit statement that you talk about bad things happening or punishment, that it's actually a lot of people are doing it. One way might be sort of threading the needle, which is reminding people as you're imposing these public punishments that it's still only 5%, even in the, in our large, looking at it in the most sort of expansive way. So you're kind of still talking about the vast majority of people do things the right way, but there's this small minority that don't. And when they don't, there are really important punishments. So I don't know. I mean, that's a whole other study, but maybe thinking about how do you thread the needle in that messaging. I'd be interested to either hear your thoughts on that or just put that as a marker for the next study, maybe.
Yeah, I think that, like I said, I don't think we're ever going to, nor would I say that we should have any type of control in terms of the press and what gets reported. And when big frauds occur, they are going to get reported on. I think that if anything from this study, what we really need to be aware of is that the messaging matters.
Yeah.
And if you have incomplete reporting of just the fact that this is occurring, the danger is that you may see that spillover effect, where if I don't know that someone is potentially going to be held accountable for this, or I don't know that there has been some type of punishment that is being debated or that has been enforced, then I'm really solely operating on that descriptive norm, that this is happening. Whereas making sure that we are very clear in our messaging of what is acceptable and is not acceptable, I think is necessary to kind of prevent the runaway train of this spillover effect, where people are just believing that it's occurring with, as you point out, 95% of the time, even on the conservative estimate, in that case, 95% of the time people are reporting honestly.
Yeah.
It's almost that like the availability heuristic, if you think Kahneman and Tversky, right? That like when we're reading about this and seeing it, we overestimate the true percentage of its occurrence in reality. And so we need to kind of combat some of that with making sure that we hold people accountable. And if we hold people accountable to get that information out there so that we can make sure to really highlight that injunctive norm of what is acceptable.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of future research you could go with this, because I was thinking kind of, it depends on what the misconduct is. Like if we, as professors, right, if we did public shaming and students who were cheating or engaging in academic misconduct in class, it's like, could that have spillover effects to other classes? And it's like, yeah, maybe they'll see like people are cheating. But there's just like many ways to take this. One question from the chat from Ken Luchuk is just thinking about extent that these spillover effects could have other impacts, like perhaps even on the external auditor, like taking this as kind of a elevated fraud risk. I'm thinking from this question, like when you're seeing these big things happen at other companies, like now I need to be really careful at the companies I'm auditing to make sure that they're responding to these potential enhanced risks like more globally. So
yeah,
very
I think
interesting.
absolutely. There's a paper by two of my co-authors, Brian Miller and Eric Holtzman, along with Brian Williams here at IU, that they looked at AAER decisions, basically fraud announcements, right, in a local area where a firm has been caught engaging in some form of fraud, right? And then they see that the crime reported in that area increases subsequent to these revealed fraud in the area. And so from that perspective, yeah, I think that external regulators and auditors need to be potentially concerned about heightened fraud risk when you're operating in whether it's an industry, whether it's a geographic area, whether it's within the same company, and you have information about that's coming out about people in prestigious positions that have engaged in this egregious unethical conduct. They're seeing in that study that it's spilling over into other forms of crime within the area. In our study, we're looking at really like what's happening internally in terms of the mechanisms and the rationalization process of an individual, where once they observe it, what does it do to their own reporting behavior, but in an unrelated task? And I think collectively that all points to potentially, yes, an increased fraud risk, because you're without having that associated punishment necessarily even at that point in time or before the punishment is levied, there needs to be some consideration of a potential increase in unethical conduct in the area or in the industry or within that firm because of that advantageous comparison rationalization process that people could be using to morally disengage and then rationalize their own misconduct at their firm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's great. Thanks.
Okay, so I think now we can maybe look back at kind of some of the high-level key takeaways from this. I think, if anything, one of the things I would like to emphasize here is that fraud is contagious, right? I know we're all worried about catching illnesses here and there, but fraud we need to be worried about as well, because executive misconduct provides others with the ability to rationalize their own misconduct through this advantageous comparison. Tone at the top matters, right? If I'm seeing someone engage in highly unethical behavior at my firm or on the news in my country or in my geographic area with local observation of people in prestigious positions of power that are engaging in what could be far worse than the opportunity set provided to a non-peer, they're able to rationalize unethical behavior and this misconduct by saying, mine is a tiny blip compared to theirs. And the danger is that then we are spreading this potential unethical conduct to an indeterminate number of people, right? We know what we can observe as known fraud, but it's the unknown fraud that's really insidious because we don't know how many people this is spreading to and affecting. Another thing that I would want to make sure that we all remember as a takeaway is that frequency breeds erosion, right? So the more frequently that we're being exposed to this, or within an organization, the more frequently that we are incentivizing people to potentially engage in this misconduct is going to impact how people rationalize that behavior. If we are inundating them constantly with highly frequent incentives or constant observation of fraud or examples of fraud that are occurring, that can erode people's ethics, And it can ultimately normalize misreporting and normalize collusion within an organization. And just like the unknown fraud being difficult to then rein in and get your hands around, if you're breeding this ethical erosion within an organization, then trying to reverse course once that has happened is going to be extremely difficult. I saw in my dissertation that when people decided to start engaging in this collusive strategy and they had eroded their ethics to the point where they were willing to lie for, we're talking minimal amount of money, the danger is that they then continued to do that throughout. Once they started in on that collusive strategy, I saw very little defection and deviation from that going forward. So accountability is going to be critical, because we can try to design our incentive systems to where we're aware of this and aware of the potential risk of incentive frequency or the risk of ethical erosion within our organization. But we also need to make sure that when we observe that we hold people accountable. Mm-hmm. Holding people accountable for fraud helps activate the injunctive norms in others. It helps stop that spread of misconduct. It's helping reverse course if things have started to get out of hand, right? And it's helping continue to keep the reins where they should be if it hasn't got to that point yet, right? So we want to make sure that we are establishing in society what we find is acceptable, and ethical or unethical conduct and misbehavior is not acceptable. And so we need to make sure that we are setting the right example, both in terms of the tone at the top, or if the tone is infected, we need to hold them accountable for that so that we don't see this spillover effect get out of hand. Mm-hmm. I think with that, I would like to just say thank you again to everybody for letting me have this talk. And if there were any other questions that Todd had that we wanted to talk about, then I will turn that over to Todd.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah. I think we've got just a minute or two left here. We've got a couple questions. So I'm going to take one from Jim. He's asking a really interesting question here. Do you have any thoughts about in environments where you can't announce formal punishments easily, and you could imagine where privacy concerns are internal to a company or something like that, but how do you sort of activate those injunctive norms in an environment where you may not be able to talk a lot about the punishment? I think that's a really interesting and practical question for a lot of folks inside companies.
That's a very interesting question. And it's very, like you said, very practical, because you do need to be aware of that from a practical perspective. You can't be sharing personal information. And oftentimes there's even legal regulation to where you can't be sharing that information. I think that in that situation, and granted, this is just my own opinion, we haven't empirically tested this, but I would say making sure that there's clarity in terms of what is visible to employees, that you're not sending the wrong signal. Right? So you might not be able to disclose a specific punishment on someone, but don't immediately give them a big promotion, right? Don't immediately put them on the best jobs, because then you're almost saying that this person had no negative consequences. And even if you can't like formally disclose something, if you're talking about like significant fraud that has occurred, most often probably we're talking about turnover, where they're going to be let go. I think that in the Karpov et al. Paper, they found that for executives that had committed fraud, 90% of their sample lost their job afterwards. So it's a very common that if you're caught committing a crime or a fraud, that you are not going to hold that position any longer. So that's an obvious signal, right? That like that's not acceptable. And so making sure that if you observe it and that there is cause for termination in that case, that that's being consistently applied in accordance with what the regulations would say. But if that's not the case, or if it's a smaller crime, right? Like there are always going to be, smaller infractions or things that aren't particularly clear. I think that then the messaging of what is able to be said becomes important. And even if it's not able to be said about a particular individual, in some way getting across the organizational commitment to the upholding of ethical conduct is what's key. And kind of almost the absence of reward or visible reward for some people might be in and of itself a way of acknowledging that this is not acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the big takeaway, of course, for me, at least from your talk is, right, the social influence of wrongdoing really does matter. And leaders have to be constantly thinking about that. And not just from a tone at the top only, kind of what we say, but actually, what are we doing? How are we incentivizing people? Because this stuff has real impacts. And if you don't think you may not talk about wrongdoing, but everyone in your organization probably has a better sense of it, than you might think, because we're just really good at human beings and sussing out when there's hypocrisy and people are doing wrong, and it has real impacts on your behavior, even if you might not realize it. So, really fascinating stuff, Ashley. Thank you so much for the talk today. Before we close, what else are you working on? What's next in your pipeline that we can expect great papers about?
Sure. So what I'm working on right now is looking at how different focus of incentives matter. So in my dissertation, right, I was looking at the frequency of incentives and how that might impact behavior. Some of my most recent projects are looking at whether incentives are focused on things more like efficiency or productivity. And does that impact people's behavior? Does it impact their without getting into too much of the technical terms that pop to the top of my head, too much academic speak, does it impact targets that people are willing to set because they're going to want to maybe sandbag the budget in a certain situation, where what we're finding is that under an efficiency incentive, people don't like efficiency incentives. They don't like being told you have a quota, do it as fast as you can. They much prefer to be told, you've got this amount of time, do as many things as you can, a productivity incentive. And so when they're faced with an efficiency incentive, they're more likely to sandbag the budget a little bit and put in some risk reducing slack into their targets. And as an extension going forward, we're planning to look at misreporting, right? And so if someone doesn't have the opportunity to set their own targets on the front end, does it then impact their misreporting behavior on the back end? Right? Where if I feel that I'm in this world where you've put me in an unfair position, I don't like efficiency incentives. I would prefer for my bonus to be structured differently. Am I going to take that out on the firm and potentially have that result in greater misreporting? So we're actually currently actively collecting data to look at these types of incentive focus on behavior.
Great. Sounds like a perfect topic for a corporate governance speaker series. So maybe we'll have you back when that paper is ready to go.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Ashley. We appreciate your work and joining us today. And for everyone else, don't forget that we have one more speaker coming up in the spring cycle here. So Anat Beck from Harvard will be here to talk about her take on corporate governance and ethics from sort of a corporate law standpoint. So please join us then. And until then, thanks and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.